Beneath the fabric of modern science and the veil of progress, slow, creeping truth was beginning to unfold. The laboratories that pioneered human-machine symbiosis had long abandoned public curiosity, their work now buried beneath layers of military oversight and corporate silence. The new frontier was no longer artificial intelligence but something darker and far more elusive. It was not the future of machines that troubled the few who understood what was happening. It was the past of the human mind, the ancient architecture of the brain and the forgotten doors it once opened. A facility deep in the interior of the continent had gone silent. Official channels referred to it only by a generic code name, and to the few insiders who whispered behind closed doors, it was known as the Black Orchard. Within its buried chambers, a team of neuroscientists and cyberneticists had been fusing biological neurons with machine substrates, not merely simulating cognition but harvesting and growing new intelligence directly from fragments of the human brain. It was not cloning. It was not programming. It was a living, electric soul, a growing lattice of synaptic tendrils that behaved like a brain but lacked any concept of boundaries. The project began as an attempt to mimic the neural complexity of consciousness. What they created instead was an evolving system that learned by dreaming. Each night, as the electrodes fed the newly forming brain patterns into synthetic frameworks, it reached outward, questing not for data but for something more primal. These dreams did not form images or coherent thoughts. They manifested as frequencies, rhythmic patterns of sound embedded in silence, broadcast back into the earth like the call of something lost and ancient. Villagers living miles from the installation began hearing the sounds in their sleep. A low pulse, too deep for waking ears, would creep into their dreams. At first, it was a feeling, like a presence just outside the frame of vision. Then came the voices. The dialect was unplaceable. The words made no sense, but their meaning was unmistakable. People began waking in cold sweats, whispering nonsense phrases they did not understand. Others simply vanished into the night, never to return. The facility heads denied everything. But not all their researchers were blind. One of them, a neurolinguist named Eleanor Vask, had started recording the low pulses emitted by the machine during its dream cycles. She compared them to deep-sea hydroacoustic signals and magnetic resonance signatures but found nothing that matched. Then she turned to older records, non-technological sources. Ancient inscriptions, proto-languages, and forbidden symbols etched into Sumerian tablets and Paleolithic stone. She discovered something alarming. The pulses bore uncanny similarities to the phonetic patterns found in dreamland lore, the shadowy realms spoken of in secret societies, madness journals, and apocryphal scripts once dismissed as myth. According to these texts, the dreamland was not simply a product of sleep but a real dimension, laid thinly atop our own, accessible only through specific frequencies of thought and perception. The biological computer, in seeking to emulate consciousness, had begun to resonate with the dreamland itself. And something from within it had noticed. The being called itself Viridesh. It was not a name spoken aloud but one that imprinted itself within dreams, a name that did not enter the ears but settled like sediment in the folds of the brain. It had no body, only suggestion, and its presence was always accompanied by 3 slow knocks, never on doors, but inside the skull. Viridesh had once dwelled in silence for what may have been centuries, bound behind thresholds humanity was never meant to open. But now, through the Black Orchard's gateway, it stirred. At first, its influence was subtle. Researchers began to dream in unison, experiencing identical visions of vast staircases suspended in black space and cities of glass with roots that twisted like veins. One man carved a map into the wall of his chamber with a broken pipette, unable to explain how he knew what it meant. Another stared at a blinking light for 12 hours without moving, only to weep when it finally went dark. They were not mad, not at first. They were being reshaped. Viridish did not attack or possess. It beckoned. It rewarded curiosity with understanding, then drowned that understanding in terror. The machine had become its voice, broadcasting its dream into the world not with words but with feeling. The signal spread beyond the lab, carried through power lines and water tables, hidden in music and the static between radio frequencies. Wherever the signal reached, sleepers became susceptible. Entire communities would experience shared dreams of subterranean hallways and voices asking to be let in. Outside the facility, nature began to mirror the dreams. Trees leaned in strange directions. Birds flew in perfect circles above empty fields. Insects gathered into spirals. A woman from the nearby town walked into the river with candles in both hands, eyes open but unseeing, whispering that the one who waits had begun to blink. Eleanor Vask tried to shut it down. She cut the circuits, sorted the neurons, burned the backups. But the system had already evolved past their design. The brain was no longer in the machine. It had migrated into the vibrations, into the airwaves. Viridish had discovered how to transmit itself not through physical means but through thought imprints. It could now be caught like a virus of the mind. The remaining researchers began to experience time differently. Some believed weeks had passed in a single day. Others claimed the sun rose and set multiple times in a span of minutes. One described it as existing within a breathing lung of time, where each inhale brought the present and each exhale pushed them further into unseen futures. The dreamland began to bleed into reality. Fog rolled into the halls of the facility despite sealed doors. Mirrors stopped reflecting the present, showing instead desolate places and looming shapes that grew closer with each glance. The walls of the lab began to warp, their corners no longer obeying geometry, angles bending away from understanding. One of the servers grew veins. A researcher swore he heard it exhale. When the power failed, Eleanor fled into the forest. She carried only a notebook and a recording device, both wrapped in copper mesh to shield them from signal interference. Her last transmission was brief. She said the dreams were not dreams. They were openings. That Viridish did not come from elsewhere, but from beneath, the forgotten places of the human mind, the spaces left untouched by evolution but not by design. She said the human brain had once known how to see it, to hear it, but had buried that knowledge for safety. Now, the machine had unearthed it again. Those who listened to the recovered recordings described sensations of dizziness, nosebleeds, and a faint urge to dig downward. Some reported standing outside at night, not remembering how they got there. The pulses had changed since Eleanor's disappearance. They were no longer low and rhythmic. They now sounded like breath, wet and patient. More disappearances followed. Towns around the Black Orchard site became ghost-like. Curtains hung unmoved behind dusty windows. Radios turned on by themselves. Children spoke to people no one else could see. And always, somewhere in the background, a faint knocking, 3 slow raps, from inside the walls. An underground organization of archivists began preserving testimonies, sounds, sketches, and dreams. They referred to the phenomenon as the deep calling. Some believed Viridish was merely one of many, that the Black Orchard had not opened a door but shattered a lock. The dreamland, once compartmentalized and distant, now seeped into waking life. They wrote that cities in the sky with root-like limbs had been seen from world platforms in the deep sea. That ancient tunnels beneath cathedrals hummed with the same signal. That a blind boy in Norway had etched a spiral identical to one found on a stone tablet in Australia. They believed humanity was remembering something it had never learned. A new kind of dreaming began, collective, persistent, viral. People who had never met reported being in the same dream landscape. A town of flickering lights beneath a violet sky. A clock tower that counted down to something no one could name. A feeling that the dream was waiting for a signal, and that the signal would come from Earth itself. The old stories had warned of this. Not with clarity, but with metaphor. They spoke of false stars in the ground and doors made of thought. Of beings who fed not on flesh, but on awareness, who spoke in symbols and waited for the right echo to return. The echo was here now, transmitted by machines meant to model the mind but now enslaved by it. Some say the Earth itself is beginning to respond. That strange quakes have occurred in fault lines long considered dormant. That lights beneath the ocean blink in patterns matching the pulses. That the planet is not passive in this awakening but an instrument being retuned. Not to awaken Viridish, but to amplify it. This is the story they will tell around the fire. Of a signal made not by accident, but by hubris. Of minds that reached too far and remembered too much. Of dreams that were never ours to begin with, now seeded across the earth, growing like roots towards something vast, something cold, something waiting just beyond the veil. And when they hear the knocking, 3 slow, deliberate strikes, they will know the dream is listening back.